I'm very excited to be joined by Bart Layton, a British writer, director, producer whose debut feature, The Imposter, which Ted and I loved, won the BAFTA for Outstanding Debut and was shortlisted for the Academy Award for Best Documentary. He followed with the Sundance premiering hybrid heist film we loved, American Animals, in 2018, which earned him multiple British Independent Film Award nominations and a Writers Guild of Great Britain Award for Best Screenplay. In the mid-2000s, he co-founded London production company Raw, where he has created, directed, and produced numerous notable nonfiction projects, including Locked Up Abroad, The Deepest Breath, and Fear City. Welcome, Bart.
Wow, thanks for having me. You've done your homework. There's a lot of that I'd put into you know, the deep past, but that's
Well,
impressive.
it's an incredible LA noir thriller you've written and directed, Crime 101, that we're here to talk about now. It's in, you said its fifth week in theaters.
Yeah, either fifth or sixth. Yeah.
And Ted and I absolutely loved it. We saw it in the theater on a big screen, and we've been telling everyone to see it, but this is really going to hopefully get everyone out into the theater. It is
Great.
such a satisfying LA noir, but it also feels very current in its gender politics and its humor. And I wonder what was the first thing on the page or in your imagination that made you think, I have to make this film?
That's a very good question. I think probably I felt like, I don't know whether you felt like this as well, but I felt like a lot of those kinds of movies that I had really grown up sort of adoring as a kid and as a young person, and they were the things that you'd maybe get dragged to by your mum or your dad, which were in that sort of, they were sort of broadly entertaining, but they were also properly grown up films. And I thought, like, where had they gone? A little bit. They feel like from the cinema maybe we're getting fewer and fewer of them. And I read this short story, and I was actually, in London now. I was in the depths of a pretty miserable winter. I think it was COVID, lockdown, all of that. And there was something about the kind of, it was all set on the 101 freeway. The short story is actually set in San Diego. And at the time I'd never been there, but it all felt like a kind of great ray of sunshine. And I just was really enjoying that. And I think Don Winslow wrote it as a bit of a homage to like Elmore Leonard or some of those crime writers that he loved. And I thought, I remember getting like 2/3 of the way through it and thinking, wow, this is really fun. And I remember thinking, I really hope that the third act delivers something worthy of the first and second. And then it did. There's a bit of a twist. And I remember thinking, God, I would love to take credit for that. There's a lot that I will take credit for, but certainly there was this one thing which I did not see coming. And I thought, okay, this could be a really delicious thing to try and adapt. And, with a view to would it be one of those kinds of, one of those kind of film noir kind of movies that I guess I felt like that's what I wanted to go and see in the theater. And I also felt like it offered up a superstructure on which to hang maybe some bigger, more interesting ideas about how we live. And I guess that is always the thing that for me is the crucial thing to find. It's something which is really and truly a ripping yarn. You're completely hooked in from
Yeah.
beginning to end. And I
Yep.
think if you land that successfully, you've got the audience in a good place where they are, where they're locked in and they want to know what's going to happen next. And I think that's the thing that hopefully allows us as filmmakers or writers the opportunity to start to explore things which are, I guess, a little more thought-provoking or things that I personally was interested in. And I, having spent quite a lot of time in LA, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with that town. There's a lot that I adore, and I often think, oh, maybe I should, move here or whatever. But there's also a lot which I think can be quite, how to put it politely, I think you can get your priorities a bit twisted you can get things mixed up. You can find yourself really consumed by things which feel like the most important thing to pursue. And if you're not careful, the pursuit of that can get you to a place where, yes, you might feel like you've arrived. You might have all the trappings of what looks like a successful life. And maybe that's at the expense of actually ever stopping to think about, what really should I be kind of most consumed with or most concerned with. And so I think that it was those two things. It was that thing of like, this is a cracking story. It feels like one of those old school movies, which I adore. And it also felt like an opportunity to start to hang, to have a skeleton on which we could start to build these bigger ideas, which I think are the things that you're talking about.
Yeah. And I didn't grow up in Los Angeles, but that's where we live now. And we drink green juice, and we're not that far from the beach. And the weather is way better than London. Sorry.
It really is.
And I think it's like you said, I mean, there are pros and cons as in any city, but I think you nail it. I think you completely capture. I think LA wants to be filmed as a noir. I think that your cinematography is stunning and it drew me in from the opening shot. Can you speak a little bit more about how you conceived it visually and thematically? Because you really do absolutely capture LA.
Oh, well, that from a LA native, that is high praise. So I'm very happy to hear that.
I still feel a little bit like I'm just absorbing the fact that we get beautiful nature in a city.
That is all the stuff that's magical about the town. Listen, I think there were a lot of things. I felt like, it's a very well photographed town. There's a lot of movies of this genre that cast a very long shadow, and you kind of have to put that out of your mind, because otherwise you sort of drive yourself crazy trying to either avoid things or include things or whatever. I think I felt like, obviously people are obsessed with making these references to Heat, and weirdly, Heat probably wouldn't be one of the things that was a very kind of close reference, although it's a movie that I adore, and, it certainly fits into those incredibly memorable experiences I had in, either, I think I was in my teens when Heat came out. But even though Heat is called Heat, I actually wanted a warmer iteration of a kind of cat and mouse heist thriller. And when I say warmer, what I mean by that is a more kind of cuddly version, where the characters are much less kind of ice cold and professional and sort of infallible. I wanted them to feel a little more like you and I. They are not just flawed, but they're not perfect. It's a slightly more domesticated heist kind of thing, if that makes sense. And I think
It is.
And I guess in terms of the visual identity of it, I tend to do a kind of an insane amount of prep, and I go and I scout and relentlessly wanted to try to find a way to reflect all of, I guess, the movie is a lot about the highs and lows. It's a lot about the haves and the have-nots, and it's about the pressure to be a somebody, and this endless pursuit of status, which is the thing I'm talking about, and where that can land you.
Yeah.
But it's also a place where there are huge kind of topographical divides, the extremely wealthy, literally, unless you live right on the coast, you live generally above everyone else. We wanted to try and find a way that you were seeing all of the different sides of the city, the fact that, for example, the movie starts in downtown LA in an Iranian, it's a genuine jeweler's store. You can go in there tomorrow. It's a functioning store. It's owned by an Iranian family who are lovely. And a lot of what happens is the very, very wealthy jewelers who are in places like Beverly Hills or Calabasas or whatever, often they will be sourcing individual stones or diamonds or whatever from a whole network of places. And what was interesting to me was that you might source a diamond from downtown, and in the short 40-minute ride that it takes to go from that, home, mom and pop store downtown to where we filmed the opening sequence, which is in Calabasas at the Commons or whatever, you will that that diamond might increase in value by, just an unthinkable amount of money, because no one who goes shopping in Calabasas is going downtown to buy their diamonds. That's just not how it works. So a lot of what we were trying to do was show how those show how all of the metrics of that kind of the mechanics of that city work. And a lot of the references were obviously, you know 70s sort of movies, to whom I guess this movie owes quite a bit of its DNA. I also came across this really beautiful, if that's the right word, this book called Atmosphere of Crime, which is by a photographer called Gordon Banks, who was a brilliant black photographer who actually became a filmmaker later. And he was commissioned by Time magazine in the 50s to do a photo journalistic essay of crime in Harlem at that time. And it was actually late 50s. And it's a really, for people who don't know the book, and I think it might be out of print at the moment, but even though this was obviously, that was the 50s, it was Harlem, there was something about the quality of the light. He's shooting at night a lot, obviously with with very, fast lenses and all the rest of it. There was a lot about the way in which the light was reflected, the halos around the street lights. There was that sort of became a bit of a touchstone for me. And then I obviously introduced my cinematographer to it, who loved it. And so that, in addition to movies like Killing of a Chinese Bookie, things like that, which had this kind of, they were naturalistic in their approach, lots of natural light. And even if it wasn't natural light we were using, we were trying to preserve a sense of every scene being lit by whatever was there. And that was one of,
Wow.
and I think the methodology was really like, can we keep, even though it's a movie and you've got it, and there's very movie-ish tropes in it, I very much wanted to find a way to keep it grounded in a very recognizable reality. I come from docs, so I
Yeah.
tend to be squeamish about too much visual effects, too much that feels inauthentic. So every time, and that was even the case with the script, with the actors, with the car chases, whatever, it would always come back to this kind of central question of, what would this really look and feel like? Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Totally makes sense. And your characters do have so much more emotional complexity than maybe you typically find in a noir, as you were saying. And since we do have podcast listeners who might not read the full synopsis of the film in the written version, do you want to describe the plot of the film, or should I talk a little about, you have this meticulous jewel thief, Davis, played by Chris Hemsworth, who feels perfectly cast. You have this really scruffy, earnest detective, Lou, played by Mark Ruffalo. Again, he's so excellent in this role, and he's really trying to prove himself while avoiding the total corruption of the LAPD. He's investigating this pattern of crimes, and you have this completely three-dimensional female character in Sharon, played by Halle Berry, who's amazing. And one of my favorite scenes of the year really is in your movie with her. So she's this disillusioned insurance broker navigating just terrible sexism and ageism in her high-end firm. And she's got that thing of both being kind of down to earth and doing yoga and living by the beach, but also having to perform her status. And she clearly has anxiety about it and where she's getting in life. And were you thinking about it from a documentary perspective? Were you thinking about them in terms of work and like what work means in this world where the system keeps failing everyone, and how that's, Ted and I talk about the system in us in the system. I don't know, for you how you achieved the level of complexity in these characters that you did, but it
Yeah,
also makes the film stand out.
it's a very generous question you ask, but yes, it's interesting you use the word systems, because that is definitely, I guess what the movie is talking about to a degree. And actually, I use that word quite a bit because I think, the first thing to say is, I will because I come from docs, even if I'm writing a a fictional character, of which all of these are, you know, the I tend to go to try and look for the closest relative of the fictional person, and you can do that. You can speak to either serving or former LAPD officers who work in that division, which I did. I spoke to a couple of them, and that's where a lot of that kind of corruption storyline developed. I spoke to one guy who had recently left the LAPD because he felt so much of the pressure on him was not to do with the community. It was to do with, making the numbers. It would almost
Yeah.
become a kind of corporation rather than a sort of, government institution. So I think there was a bit of that. And then you can even speak to jewel thieves. You can find them, you can find the convictions, you can find where they were sent to prison, you can write to them in prison, and some of them will write back to you. And so I ended up doing a lot of research into all of the different characters, including Hallie's character, who isn't really in the short story. And
Thank you for
that,
adding her.
oh, well, that actually, it was, you're welcome. Yeah. Funnily enough, that was one of the most straightforward, I guess, for me to write, just simply because I wasn't trying to adapt. I guess I was able to, shape something completely fresh. And I felt like her arc was quite straightforward in a way. I based her character on a friend of my mum's who was someone who grew up very, very impoverished and became successful and had a kind of pathological sort of refusal to entertain going back to anything resembling poverty. It had become all consuming, and her need to do that, she had bypassed things that actually I think later on she felt were really important, such as having a family. She put the career ahead of that. And of course, what happens is sometimes you get to the place you want to get to, and sometimes you find that this kind of carrot of making partner or whatever that number is that you think is going to give you that sense of security, that's constantly receding into the into the distance. And I spoke to a lot of people for whom that was a real thing, and that formed the basis of Hallie's character. So yeah, so there's a lot of kind of doc-ish research which I do with my kind of doc research team, and then I end up with a mountain of either email exchanges or telephone conversations with real people, and then try to find a way to weave that in. The problem with that is you can get very seduced by all of that, and you're like, oh, I've got to put this. I spoke to all of these jewelers downtown, like very high-end jewelers in like places like Beverly Hills, and pretty much all of them had been a victim of some kind of robbery. And some of the robberies were almost more outrageous or more kind of movie-like than the ones that I had come up with and written into the script. So you're always like, man, there's so much good material that you generate, even over and above Don Winslow's brilliant story. So,
Yeah.
you kind of, the process is just trying to whittle it down and whittle it down. And it comes down to that central question that we started at, and your very first question, which is, what is it really about for you as the filmmaker? Because you live with these things for so long that the plot isn't really enough. You have to have a thing that you want to explore, which is beyond just the nuts and bolts of, oh, it's a fun caper movie with a cop chasing a robber. That becomes not secondary, but it becomes, the what is it about becomes equally important to the plot, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. Again, we were Ted and I discussing this morning how we end up with the unbelievable levels of corruption that we have now in our government and business, in the systems that we live in, and family systems too, and personal relationships. There are just all kinds of these levels of corruption. And your film not only has these very multi layered characters, but actually plots a way for them to intersect. So even if you did mountains of research, you've whittled it down into this highly engaging, well-crafted story that has you on the edge of your seat because you don't know exactly where it's going next, and you don't know where, why, or how these characters are necessarily going to intersect when, and you feel like you're rooting for them not to fuck up or not to become corrupt or to go another way, and I don't know how you did that, but, I mean, I think that is also very different from documentary where you're watching something unfold most of the time and you're not controlling it. So you were able to control this narrative, and how the hell did you do that?
Man, I guess just a lot of drafts. I think I'm very good at a first draft, and I'm increasingly shit at all of the subsequent drafts. And I think I've worked with brilliant writers who can kind of, you get the first draft and then you give your notes and they tear the whole thing up. And I'm like, wait, hang on, what? We didn't need to just throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think my problem is I tend to get a little too quickly locked into one version or one structure, and I'm less good at kind of tearing it up and going back to the drawing board. In this case, I had a really fantastic template, in the form of the short story. So you kind of know broadly the beginning, middle, and end. And then I started to explore. And once I'd introduced the female character, I guess I tried to find a way where you introduce all of these characters, knowing that at some point they are all on a collision course. And you don't know how, but because you know that they are, that becomes intriguing in and of itself. And then the challenge becomes, how do you make sure that they're equally compelling so that every time you leave Chris's character and you go to Mark's character, you don't have this feeling of like, why have you just, I was so enjoying that. Why have you now ripped me out of that story and I'm now in a different movie? And then you're enjoying Mark's story, and then now, okay, now I'm over in Hallie's story, and then you're in Hallie's story, and now I'm going to Barry Keoghan. And I think that was the challenge of making sure that all of those scenes felt very taut, that there was a kind of electricity and a propulsion running through it. And I feel,
Yeah,
and I guess what I tend to do is just keep rewriting and keep trying to reduce it and distill it. And I don't know how technical you want to get. I
yeah,
guess what I would generally do is go for a very long prep process so that I can so that by the time you get to the set, you know why every scene is there, you know why every line is there, and you've had the time to interrogate it. And
yeah,
I work with a, a kind of a guy, an amazing British guy called Ian Seller, who used to run the National Film and Television School directing course. And we will sit and he will basically just go, what's this? Why is that there? What is this word? And we'll go in that kind of level of detail so that actually the finished movie, I think, is unusually close to the script. There were a few scenes that we had to lose because of time, but broadly, it's the same structure. Everything's in the same order. All of the transitions between scenes are very cleverly, carefully planned. So there's not really many surprises in the edits. And I think that if that methodology was applied, I think that's what they do at Pixar, right? Because, you don't want to animate a whole ton of stuff that you're not going to use, right? But I
yeah,
feel like if that methodology was applied to these huge movies that ended up having massive reshoots and stuff, because at least
yeah,
you have a pretty good sense that broadly the whole thing does work. And of course, there are things when you get into the edit, you're like, that didn't work as well. But my experience of it is the things that and I had this with American Animals as well. The things that you feel nervous, like that feels like a big swing, it might not work because you haven't seen it before. Generally, those are the things that really do. They're memorable, and they're the things that people remember, and they're the things that you're really glad that you did it, even though it felt a little bit dicey or a bit unconventional. So I think, I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it's just,
yeah.
finding a rhythm that allows you to be in each of the stories, even though they seem unconnected, you're having a really good time in each of them. And you're kind of constantly like wanting to know what's going to happen next.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also, again, you bring your characters together in these ways that intersect them, and it's outstanding.
There's a couple of very complicated transitions where they pass each other on the freeway. That is unbelievably difficult to do, especially because I don't tend to try and do too much in visual effects. I try to do as much in camera as possible. But those things are the things that you think, that's going to cost us a day or half a day. And is it really worth it? And is it too complicated? But actually, those are the things that when you do it and they do work, you're like, that's the exhilarating bit
Really
of the
well.
job, I think.
Yes, yes, exactly. Yes, and yeah, not to throw another movie reference in, but I feel what you described in terms of the tautness of a scene or knowing exactly the meaning and purpose of every single scene for every character and being able to therefore move quickly from scene to scene is like One Battle After Another, which just won 6 Oscars. It's like how I think the best films work. Noir has this really long history of using women as symbols or plot devices rather than as people, and of punishing them for wanting more. So I feel like, again, back to Halle Berry's character, you created this woman with this desire and ambition. I wonder how you maybe negotiated that on the page versus with Halle Berry. Maybe that's one that's good to discuss how you, developed it as a writer versus a director, because maybe there were things in the conversation with Halle or something that, deepened it for both of you.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the only character that I wrote with a specific actor in mind was Barry Keoghan's character, because just simply because we worked together and I knew he would do it. Otherwise, it's a risky endeavor. If you write with an actor in mind and then they're not up for it, it
They're
takes
not
a bit of a mental shift to readjust. There were people I dreamed of, and Hallie included. But with that character, I based it on this friend of my mother's who I remember. And one of the reasons I remember her so well, even though, I haven't seen her in probably 20 years, is that we took her on holiday we have this little kind of crumbling shack in the south of Spain, and it's an incredibly beautiful place. But if you're not into that kind of level of, I don't know, what's the opposite of luxury? It's not squalor, but it's very much like it's a rural experience, right? When I was a kid, my parents didn't have any money really. My mum invited her and she had this really, not a violent reaction, but she just did not get it. And she was actually really cross with my mum for bringing her to a place that felt a lot like the poverty that she had experienced as a kid. And I remember really being struck by her reaction. And I thought a lot about that when I was creating Hallie's character. I was thinking, if you came from that kind of poverty and you'd made it your sort of life's mission to never go back there and maybe to leave it in the past, what would all of the things that you would need to have around you, and I think in LA and even in London to an extent, we all do that. We need to have this, we need to build a kind of an image that will allow other people to see us in the way that we really want to be seen. And so she has the car and she has the accoutrements and the jewelry and the watch and and the handbags and all the rest of it. And she's also the smartest person in every room, but that's not the thing that her company values. The men who run it, they kind of use her
right.
as bait, like the Selling Sunset girls or whatever. So
Yeah.
and at a certain point your expiry date starts to loom, but when that comes up, you've either got to the place that you wanted to get to, or you haven't, and maybe you've sacrificed everything and it hasn't panned out. And I thought, and I was thinking about, because if you're a good person and you've never really you've never crossed any lines of criminality, I was trying to think, well, what would be the thing that could force her to do something pretty unconscionable, but she would be able to justify it given that they kind of screwed her over so badly. And so a lot of the kind of the plotting of her character and all of those scenes was really about how can I take her from a place where, we have a sense that she's already putting up with a lot. She's going to these phenomenally wealthy kind of fat cat white billionaire guys' houses. And again, those guys were based on real guys that we met when we were scouting all
Yeah.
of those billionaire mansions. And, they have art, which is full of cultural appropriation, and they don't give two shits about the art. It's all an investment or and so
Yep.
she's already swallowing a lot. Hallie's character starts the whole movie kind of she's got not a shred of makeup on, and we see her putting her face on.
She's talked about that like war paint. Like
Yeah.
she thought of it like her war paint.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I guess, when so I was trying to build all of the building blocks of which begins with disillusionment and then ends in sort of something much more horrifying for her, which is betrayal. You know, she's given everything and she's going to get fucked over in return. So that was really me trying to map out the kind of the thing that would make someone who had been an entirely law-abiding and very diligent member of staff turn kind of to the dark side sort of thing. And interestingly, you know, when I sat down with Hallie, one of the first things she said was, I don't just know this person, I've been her. And she felt like she had such a clear idea of who she was. You know, and Hallie's background is not totally dissimilar in some ways, you know, her very early childhood and stuff. So, you know, whenever you have a conversation with a great actor, they're going to give you something that you then go away and want to try and write into the script. There were a couple of scenes where she asked me, you know, there's a scene which is always gets a big cheer in the
Yeah.
cinema, which is
Yes.
and she wanted me to write something in this interaction she has with her boss, that she wanted me to write something the day before that wasn't in the script, so that
Yeah.
something that she didn't see coming. And I kind of went away and thought, wonder what the most outrageous thing I can have him say to her that would be really upsetting, and it would also catch both Hallie as Sharon but also Hallie as herself off guard in this exchange. And so I did it, and it was pretty extreme. And I remember
You
thinking,
did.
look, maybe we'll take it out. You know, I was like, in the edit, maybe I'll keep her reaction, but I'll take out the provocation that feels a little bit below the belt. And in the end, it worked so well. I was like, fuck it, let's keep it all
Yep.
in. And she
Yep.
was so fearless. She wanted all of it.
Yep. Hallie is great in your movie, and Chris Hemsworth and Mark Ruffalo also feel incredibly well cast, and they're so strong in their performances, and these characters really, really feel lived in and true to them. But I think audiences maybe know them better in Marvel superhero suits. Was that in the back of your mind at all when you were writing them or directing them, or what were you thinking? How did you find them and cast them?
No, I'm going to be really honest. Even though I got like a young son, I am not a big Marvel guy. I'd seen Chris in Ragnarok and a couple of those things, and I thought it was brilliant.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It actually wasn't until the trailer came out, and so much of the noise was about Thor and Hulk being
Yes.
reunited that I was like, oh, wow. I mean, obviously I knew them. And whenever I spoke to someone who was under a certain age, because, you know, I think most of us think of Ruffalo as this great actor who's got this amazing body of work. You know, I remember seeing him
Yeah.
in Jane
You
Campion
can
film,
count
I
on me.
think. Well,
Oh,
that and In the Cut, if you remember that, I think he's so amazing. I think if you speak to anyone under a certain age, that their association with Ruffalo is, well, actually, no, it's probably, you know, those are the biggest movies on the planet, and probably that's what most people know him as. And I guess it wasn't what I knew him as. Obviously, with Chris, you know, I was nervous with Chris because not because I didn't think, because I'd seen him do a lot of things in other movies, which I think he makes them look very easy, and even the Thor stuff and the comedic stuff. And actually, the truth is, that's really difficult to pull off. And I think there are lots of brilliant comedic actors who actually transition magically to drama, but I'd never seen him do anything close to what I wanted him to do in this film. So I was not sure until I met with him, and I instantly was surprised by him because he's very, you know, he's annoyingly smart, and he's also, I say annoyingly because, you know, he looks the way he does, he's flipping, he's good at everything.
he's feminist. He and Mark Ruffalo, they're
Yeah.
feminists, like,
No,
their
he's
choices. That's why
Chris
I
is
love both of them. That's why they're both
his
cool.
totally, you know, and he's lovely and he's thoughtful and he
Yeah,
really understood. And I think
yeah.
he was nervous about, you know, if you're a huge action hero and someone who is a relatively, you know, inexperienced filmmaker is trying to persuade you to go against all of that and to be much more vulnerable and awkward. And, you know, I wanted to change his posture. I wanted to change his physicality. I wanted to change his voice, which, whether you notice it or not, is quite different in the in this film. It's very withheld. He doesn't have his booming superhero voice. He has this much more, almost not strangled, but it's a guy who has trauma. And we did a lot of research together. We watched a lot of testimony of people who'd lived the kind of lives that his character had lived. A lot of them had kind of blockages in their communication. You know, they weren't these super alpha kind of communicators. So a lot of what
Yep.
we worked on was a very different version of anything that Chris had done before. And he, well, I think once he understood what I was trying to do and he understood exactly what I wanted and why, he was completely committed. I think at the beginning he was just nervous that he was going to suddenly kind of unravel this sort of superhero status that he's kind of created. And I think, you know, most people feel this is by far the best thing he's ever done. I think he feels like that. And
That's so great. It's
yeah,
such a strong performance.
it's a
It
really,
really is so
really unflashy,
specific.
very
Yeah.
specific, very kind of constrained yeah, I kind of loved him more and more the more we worked together, the more
Yeah.
he, you know, once he trusts you completely. And that's so actually which was the same with all of the actors, really.
And they're all great. You also have Monica Barbaro and
Yeah.
Barry Keoghan is great. They're all your whole cast. Nick Nolte is there. I love how Monica Barbaro's character meets Chris Hemsworth too. That's also great. Um,
Yeah,
it's a good story.
she's a proper movie star. You know, I don't know what it's another, you know, but if you talk about your relationship to that kind of golden age of Hollywood, I mean, you know, if someone like Monica had shown up at that time, she would have been like intergalactic, I think. And she's very, very skilled technically, as is Halle in a way that I hadn't fully appreciated. And I think, you know, Halle has done a lot of work which isn't kind of doesn't come up to just quite how exceptionally talented she is as an actor. And I think people
Yeah,
have kind of been
yeah,
reminded by that with this. But yeah, it's a long
yeah.
way of answering your question. No, I didn't really think at all about their Marvel relationship. But I guess maybe for some people it's intriguing to see them in a different world, you know, together.
Exactly, exactly. Because film noir has, like, a strong sonic tradition, and I wonder, as you thought about the sound design and score for your movie, how you wanted to either play into that or against it and make it feel the way it does.
I guess I don't tend to generally think in relationship to other things. I tend to think I come down to this thing really, which is just about point of view, you know, like it's everything I feel like in terms of your decisions as as a filmmaker is really about how do I want the audience to feel at any given moment, and who do I want them to whose experience do I want them to feel closest to? And so that generally will kind of dictate all of the decisions, whether it's where to put the camera or what should the sound feel like. And so I wasn't really thinking about it in the context of, you know, the kind of the history of the genre or whatever. I was more just thinking about how can we put you as much in the experience as possible. And so all of the things that, car chases have been, I guess, included in movies forever, right? And so if you're going to do one, the chances of you doing something really, really inventive and new is limited. But what you can do is you can kind of have a mantra, which is, like I was saying earlier, it's like, what would this really feel like? If it wasn't like, the James Bond of jewel thieves driving the car, or it wasn't like, the Italian Job or someone who was super adept. What would it feel like if you or I found ourselves in a car chase going through, downtown LA at
Yeah.
80 miles an hour, and then again, so that is what if that's your central kind of objective, then all of the things that you're doing with camera placement and also sound design is really sort of trying to come down to that thing of like, let me put you as much in the experience yourself as I possibly can. And I think, there are a lot of really enjoyable movies that we've all seen where you're a little bit more on the outside as a viewer, and you're kind of watching these characters with whom you don't have a whole lot in common, and that can be very enjoyable as well. But what I guess I was trying to do was like, very much give you skin in the game at every point, that you feel very invested, not just in Chris's character, but all of them.
I love it. So you've got me actually thinking of a twist on what was going to be my last question, which is, when I think about LA noir and the roots of film noir here, I think of my granny who was a femme fatale in some classic movies with Fritz Lang. And so I wonder if you were gonna, because I think your film will be timeless. And I think that documentary deserves to be on the same level as fiction film. I think I've spoken with Academy Award winning documentary directors who have hilarious tales of how they're treated like second class citizens, put at like the children's table at the big awards ceremony events and all of this. And it's silly. Like this needs to change, I think. But so I'm opening it up to, if you were going to pair your movie Crime 101 with a classic film noir and something contemporary as a kind of companion piece film. It could also be documentary. It doesn't have to just be fiction. What films would you pair Crime 101 with?
Wow. Okay. I feel like it would have to, if you were going back to the sort of, yeah, the film noir of your granny's era, I feel like it probably would have to be something set in LA. And I find myself thinking of Sunset Boulevard, probably. I don't know why. I think,
Sunset Boulevard it's another classic road in LA. I mean, now it's contemporary. It's you think of the 101 freeway
yeah.
and Crime 101 and that play, but Sunset Boulevard, you can't get more classic in terms of a
So,
road in LA than that.
and I think it also had something of this question, the haves and the have-nots, that is really at the heart of Crime 101. But I also probably lean more toward To Live and Die in LA. I think is keep speaking to people who've never watched that, which I'm kind of amazed by. And then a movie that I come back to, I don't know whether you could consider it a heist movie, although obviously there's a caper. I think it was probably the first grown-up movie that I was ever introduced to, and that I must have been 9 or 10, and my mum turned on the TV and said, "There's a classic movie playing on like BBC Two or whatever," and it was The Sting, and I remember that
Oh yeah,
being just with
Robert Redford.
Redford and Paul Newman, and I
I love Paul Newman.
oh my God, I was so transfixed by that. So I guess I would have to go for one of them, and then a movie that I come back to over and over again. Um, I think because of the way it switches tones. Now, I think people have this thought that a movie really only needs to be one tone. They're like, is it a drama? Is it a comedy? Is it a tragedy? One movie which I think disproves that is Dog Day Afternoon, which is a kind of a heist movie,
Yeah.
but it's also in places a broad comedy, laugh out
Yeah.
loud, and then obviously at the end, a tragedy. And I think, yeah, so I think you'll have to pick which would be the double bill, but it would be probably one of that lot.
Yeah, no, those are great, great picks. We need to have more programming of noir. Like I'm in a nerdy group of cinephiles that's James Ponsel started with Tiffany Anders, who's a music supervisor and the daughter of Allison Anders, the writer director. And that's just watching film noir, one classic, one contemporary this group started during COVID and hasn't stopped. I love Humphrey Bogart. So there's a Humphrey Bogart that was written by a woman. It's one of the few noir written by a woman, Dorothy Hughes, that's called In a Lonely Place.
Mm.
That's one that I love.